You know, a question since I started the ALF podcast that has come up over and over again from a whole bunch of people right across Australia is how to catch a mangrove jack on lures. And as I sit here recording this introduction, I'm looking outside. It is hot, it is steamy, it is overcast, it's humid. It's perfect conditions for jack fishing. So I thought, why don't I repost one of the most popular episodes and one of the most information-packed, rich episodes about mangrove jack fishing that I've recorded in my time running the ALF podcast. And that episode is a conversation I had with John Costello back in, episode 138, so a long time ago. But the information, the content is as relevant today as the day that it was recorded, and really, really important stuff to get your head round if catching a mangrove jack is high on your priority list. So if catching a jack on a lure is your game, then this is definitely an interview that you're going to want to listen to more than once. Now, before we get into this, here's another thought. When I interviewed John way back in episode 138, I did not have a membership area for my Team Dr. Lures members. I do now. And it's thanks to those members that I've continued to be able to produce podcast episodes week after week, month after month, year after year. So if you like the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, if you get value from it, then please consider supporting the podcast by joining Team Doc Lures. Now, Team Doc Lures will give you access to members-only extended versions of many of the podcast episodes. It'll give you access to members-only audio masterclasses, to ebooks, to live streams, and online resources and tackle deals as well. That's all available at Team Doc Lures. And the cost, well, you spend more if you have a pint of beer at your local once a month than what it'll cost you to be a member of Team Doc Lures. Now, once you've drunk that beer, it's gone. But if you're a member of Team Doc Lures, the knowledge and the information and the skills that you develop as a result of that will stay with you for life. So super good value, helps to keep the podcast on air, helps to get you more fish. How can you possibly go wrong? So check it out. team.doclures.com is the URL to go to. That's team.doclures.com. Go and check that out. Join up, get all those extra goodies, and support the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast in the process. But folks, let's get into today's repost of an interview with John Costello back in episode 138, all about Gold Coast mangrove jack.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where we share the secrets of Australia's lure fishing gurus every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And now here's your host, Greg Vinall from doclures.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 137 of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. Great to have you here. My name is Greg Doc Lures Vinall, and my job is to help you catch lots of fish on lures by bringing some of Australia's best and brightest lure fishers onto the show and getting them to share a few of their secrets. Now, today's guest is John Costello, and John's been on the show before talking about Gold Coast flathead, but today we're talking mangrove jack, and that's probably what John is best known for, aside from his passion for teaching other people how to catch fish on lures through his website and YouTube channel, My Lure Box. If you haven't checked it out already, go and check that out. John has been plugging away there, putting up some great content, lots of instructional information, some great advice, whether you're fishing the Gold Coast, anywhere else in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, and estuaries more broadly. A lot of the advice that John has is going to work for you no matter where you are, and he gives it away so willingly. He's also got some DVDs there you can check out on his website. And folks, you'll find that John loves to give away tips. This episode is so chock-a-block with tips. You're definitely going to want to download the show notes at doclures.com. So zap over there, leave a message for John in the comments while you're at it. He'd love to hear from you. And folks, enjoy the episode. It's a cracker, and I will talk to you at the other end. John Costello, welcome back to the ALF podcast, mate.
It's great to be back, Greg. Thanks for having me on again, mate.
Mate, I didn't really have any choice. I've had a number of people that have emailed me or messaged me or left messages on the show notes of various episodes saying, when are you going to get John back on the show to talk about jacks? So you didn't have any choice. I didn't have any choice. I was going to have to keep badgering you until you came on, mate.
Oh, mate, it's really nice to hear. I've been doing it for a while now. I've been a jack-obsessed fisherman for a while now, and I've shared a few tips over the years with people, so it's nice to hear that people are sort of getting in contact with you. More than happy to do it again tonight.
Excellent stuff. Well, we're going to have a great time talking jacks. Now, mate, you've been on the show before. You did a sterling job talking Gold Coast flathead a while back. talking about getting on the top water lures and on the big crossfires and that sort of stuff. So we kind of know who you are. We've done all that introductory stuff, so we might skip that and maybe have a little bit of a chat about the Gold Coast in the late spring, early summer months when the water's starting to warm up, and what the fishing's going to do over the next couple of months for those that are keen to toss a few lures around those Gold Coast waters, mate. So give us a bit of a heads up, mate. What's going to be coming on the chew in the coming months?
It's really starting to hit full swing now, and the canals and the rivers are just becoming loaded with bait, and there's a lot of trevally getting around. Late afternoon trevally fishing on the Gold Coast right now is red hot. You can go out there and chase them with surface poppers and any sort of minnow lures, and you're going to get your hands on some trevally. There's good whiting that's sort of come into the top water scene this time of year as well. And you've also got, obviously, Mangrove Jack, and we'll talk on that for the rest of the episode, but bass fishing, Saratoga fishing out at Hinds Dam is really good. The bass in the backwaters of the rivers around the Gold Coast starts to fire this time of year as well. So, mate, it all happens here on the coast.
Yeah. So no shortage of options. No shortage of options in the fresh or the salt by the sounds of it. So, mate, you're saying that the bait are starting to congregate in the Gold Coast waterways now. What are the predominant bait species that gather at this time of year?
Mainly you've got loads of schools of herring, and the mullet schools come in. That's sort of what you go to imitate, and then there's times there's prawns and shrimp that get around as well. So they're the main ones, and most guys tend to use lures that represent even garfish, mullet and herring.
All right. So, and the trevally, they're obviously a hot option at this time of year. So give us a couple of quick clues as for, if we hadn't fished the Gold Coast very much and we're looking for maybe a land-based spot or two and then a spot for those who've got a kayak or a boat, give us a heads up on some likely spots.
Yeah, so there's a lot of lakes around the Gold Coast that are sort of fed through the canals, and it's those entrances to the lakes where a lot of the time those trevally sort of hang out. They hang around bridges as well, and late afternoon, especially if there's a tidal run into those lakes or out of those lakes, if you go throwing from land-based around those with just small surface poppers, something around that 60 to 70 mil range that sort of represents a juvenile or small herring, that's really the way to go. So you can get onto them that way. And, mate, they're a lot of fun. Like here, I was literally out there doing it last night, and they're heaps of fun. The bust-ups, this time of night, if you go down to the lakes around the Gold Coast, whether it's Lake Wonderland, Lake Intrepid in the Nerang, the back lake at Coomera River, even the duck ponds up the back of Currumbin, if you go and fish those areas late afternoon, it's just constant disturbance of bust-ups on the water as the sun goes down and into the night. It's a lot of fun, and it lasts about an hour after dark usually.
So there you go, folks. If you're on the Gold Coast, whether you live there or whether you just happen to be visiting, there's a ton of great options there for you to go out, toss a few lures around. You only have to spend an hour or two, that late afternoon into the evening, tossing around some small poppers. You can have a lot of fun. Mate, what are the predominant trevally species that are turning up there?
You've got like GTs, but it's mostly big eyes that you see carrying on around the coast. They're the ones that you'll generally get good numbers of those.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, mate. Enough of the chit-chat. Let's get on to Mangrove Jacks, because I know as soon as some people see your name come up on the episode, they're going to want to hear about Jacks. They're not going to worry about trevally. So, mate, you've been fishing for Mangrove Jacks in that part of the world for a pretty long time. You do a lot of talks at tackle shows and club nights and all that kind of stuff on targeting Jacks on the Gold Coast. So give us a big tip, mate. What's something that you've learned about targeting Jacks in the Gold Coast area specifically that perhaps the average fisherman wouldn't know about?
Look, I think the biggest thing, and there's going to be a few things that we touch on tonight as we go through the podcast, but I would say the biggest thing is to really try and nail down your casting accuracy, Greg. And it doesn't matter whether you're fishing in the canals or in a little creek or out somewhere in the broadwater, being able to land your lure right on that spot, like literally on the nose of where the Mangrove Jack's going to be sitting, right, butting that lure up right against a retaining wall or dragging it right beside a pontoon to the point where you're basically like, you've got to be scaring the paint off the lure. It's got to be right in there, mate. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I can suggest that people work on if they're going to get serious about jack fishing. It's got to be that casting accuracy first. And that's probably the big thing that frustrates people, or that makes it more difficult to guys and girls getting into jack fishing to actually get their first jack in the boat, is just that their casts are a metre or so away more often than not. You've got to be within that foot range or less to be a genuine shot at getting a fish.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, there are species out there where you can cast a lure within a metre or two or 4 or 5, sometimes even 10 metres, and it's good enough, Jacks aren't one of those. Jacks, you've got to be right on the money. So, mate, give us a couple of quick casting tips. I mean, I know there's no substitute for practice, of course. You just got to get out there and practice and practice and practice. And sometimes it pays to practice on dry land, not on the water. So you're actually just focusing on casting and nothing else, not getting distracted. But, mate, give us another couple of tips for landing that lure consistently where you want it.
Yeah, so 100%, it's time with the reel and the rod in your hand. But I've found that I generally use shorter bait casting rods. Like if someone's dead set keen on chasing a mangrove jack with cast and retrieve style lure fishing, a lot of them are going to be fishing with a bait casting setup. And I use a shorter rod, which allows me to get a lot more accuracy myself. And it's just that repeatability of constantly landing your lure in the area that gives you that chance. The other side of it is it's always a big playoff with the different types of line that you're going to be using to go not too heavy but not too light, because you're basically handing over lures if you're going too light. But if you're running really heavy line, that can play out as making it really difficult to get your lure right in the right spot all the time as well. So I use a low profile bait casting reel, like I use a Shimano Corrado, and if I get down to it, it's really about, that's a light bait casting setup with a real heavy, strong, smooth drag. And the reason that I like those lighter bait casting reels is because for a jack, you're going and you're putting in hundreds of casts in a session. So if you're going to get most of those on the money, you need to have the endurance and a really heavy reel, like an oversized. If you're using spinning outfits, I often see guys running 4,000s, and to me, that'll just ruin my hand using that all day, flicking on different angles. And if you're using a bait casting outfit, a lighter bait casting setup that's still got the guts in it to be able to haul a big fish out, that's probably just another pointer when you're starting to get your casting going and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, guys and girls, when you're fishing for jacks or any of those species that hang tight to cover, you're not going to catch them unless the lure is tight to cover. So there's no point worrying about your lures. You've got to get them in there. The lure that's in your box or safely a metre from the bank is not going to catch any fish. So what's the point of having it there? You've got to put your lures in danger is the bottom line.
Yeah, it's a crazy game, Greg. Like, the nature of going after them is really completely the opposite of playing it safe. You're literally trying to lose your lure. Is my suggestion when I tell people about where to throw it. You find a spot and you go, I reckon I could lose my lure in there, and that's where you want to throw it.
Yeah. It's rather perverse when you think about it, but it's actually very, very true. And of course, that's only half the battle. Once you've got the lure in there, then you've got to get the fish out. We'll come to that in a moment because that's another whole story in itself. All right, mate, let's start to narrow down a little bit the hunt for the mighty mangrove jack. So there's lots and lots of places around the Gold Coast where jacks hang out, lots of different structures. So you've got your rock walls, you've got snags, you've got deep holes, you've got all sorts of things, pontoons, plenty of places for them to be. So for somebody who was just getting started, where would you suggest they start looking this time of year when the water's starting to warm up, the jacks are just starting to get active? Where are the sort of prime haunts?
If I'm really specific, like the Gold Coast, just to take a broad look really quickly, the Gold Coast has got over 400 k's of canals, and there would be probably tens of thousands of pontoons in those canals, and a lot of the canals are lined with rock walls. To nail it down, if it was me going after a mangrove jack as a beginner, I would be focusing on the deep rock walls and running my lure. If I was cast and retrieve fishing, I'd be running my deep diving lure down along those rock walls. And there's areas right throughout the Coomera, and I'd probably start in the mid-sections of the Coomera River, Nerang River. Currumbin's a much smaller system, and then maybe down at Tweed there's some big rock bars and rock walls around the Tweed in those mid and upper sections of the Tweed River. So that for me would probably be the way that I would start doing it. And as I was hitting those rock walls, I'd definitely be hitting the bridge pylons as well. So they'd be the key locations to get a start. But once you go past fishing all of those rock walls, then you can really start to nail down some other sort of nuanced styles of fishing. And maybe we can get into that in a little bit. But that would be the best place to start. If someone was coming to the Gold Coast looking for how to get onto a few, go and find those big, deep rock bars and use deep diving lures running down and sitting them down in front of those rock walls and hang on.
Excellent stuff. Now, look, the rock walls, they're an obvious one. The pontoons, also bridges, of course. I didn't mention those, but you picked up on them. But, mate, if you were to go, there's, like you say, tens of thousands of pontoons. There's dozens of bridges. hundreds of rock walls. But if you were to go out and say, this is the prime, like if you were to see a snag or you were to see a rock wall, you were to see a pontoon and it screamed out to you, this is where a mangrove jack's going to be, what would it be? What would be the factors there that would say to you, this is good jack territory, as opposed to that rock wall over the other side there that's probably less likely?
Yeah. Okay, so, mate, there's a lot in this, and this is probably one of the draw cards for jack fishermen that are coming to the Gold Coast trying to get giants. Now, I'm not sure how many viewers have realised, but in southeast Queensland, we get, on average, a lot bigger jack and the potential for really big jacks in our systems, and they tend to hang around in our systems a little bit longer before they head out offshore like they do at times up north and things like that. But there are some giants down here, and that's sort of the appeal for a lot of people that are starting to see these really big fish being taken. So there's a whole lot in it that you can layer on top of things to try and give yourself the best opportunity. And hopefully, we should definitely talk about water temperature and clarity today, but what I might start on is really looking for, obviously, the heavy structures, but you're trying to find areas that have got shadows on them. And if you're fishing early morning, late afternoon, then obviously you're going to have bigger areas of shadows. But sections like the shadow lines under bridges, or you've got retaining walls on the Gold Coast as well, which in the morning cast a shadow, and then obviously underneath a pontoon. So it's those areas that I tend to select as my first point. If I was deciding between one bank or another, I'm looking for the bank that's got the most shadows on it, or the side of a pontoon that's got the most shadows on it. But that's just a real single point start. But what you're also looking for is, if you're going into a canal system, it's very daunting for a lot of fishermen that come from, say, Brisbane down to the Gold Coast and turn into the Coomera River boat ramp and throw their tinny in and then have a look on the map and go, geez, it's a giant system. Where the hell do I start?
Yeah.
And for someone that's doing that, you're looking for those shadowed sections. You're also looking for the main bait pathways, which is an obvious thing that you might hear from blokes that have dialed in their fishing on any podcast. But the entrances to those canals where the bait has to come in and go out, those few pontoons or those retaining walls at those entrances are always a really good starting point. So there's a couple of points that might help get people going. And I certainly use shadows a lot. And that goes right the way up to the backwaters of systems where you've got those overhanging structures, the trees and, the mangrove systems and the laydowns and things like that. I'm always picking those apart. And if I go right into detail just quickly on fishing natural structure on the Gold Coast, which there is some stunning spots up the back of some of these rivers, you've got areas that are very shallow, that don't get hit by the average jack fisherman, that still hold great numbers of mangrove jack. And it's a lot of fun to be able to try and get your lures into those zones. And I tend to do it using skip casting techniques, which is, insane fun. So there's some ideas on what you might go looking for.
Mate, I'm scribbling away frantically here. There's a ton of great information coming out of this. So, look, some key things that I've heard, and you probably said the word shadows about 15 times. So, guys, take note. That's probably a fairly important point. Look for the shadows. Okay, we know that they like structure, really, really dense, thick. If you're going to lose your lure in it, that's the place to look. You're looking for that deep water. You've said a couple of times, around the entrance of those canals, places where the bait fish have to go through to get in and out of the canals. They're the likely haunts. Now, mate, the other thing that you mentioned that we're going to circle back on now is you talked about water temperature and water clarity. So give us the lowdown on how they affect the jack fishing.
So obviously the jacks, mate, they're an incredible predator, the way that they use their ambush techniques. And we spoke quickly on the shadows. You look at the pupil on a jack's eye, it's massive. So it can pick up things in super low light. So that's where the shadow things come in. But when you look at things like, we'll start with water clarity, they're using that like bull sharks in the systems are very similar, but they have really poor eyesight. But a jack tends to use that discoloured water to sit behind structures underneath structures and then have bait come straight to it. And that's part of the reason why they don't necessarily have that behaviour of moving a long distance to pick up on a lure. They're very used to being able to use their sort of predatory style to have bait come right into their face by those shadows and the discoloured water. So generally what I'll do when I go out to a system is, and it's not always the case, I've caught plenty of good jacks in clear water at times, but generally I'll put in and start heading up the river and look for that colour change. And often it's made much more obvious if you've had some runoff and some rain recently, then you sort of find the bait and that water discolor much more distinctive in a system. But yeah, the clarity for me is just one signifier of being able to locate a zone where the fishing is just going to start to ramp up. And often it's that sort of change, or it might even be brackish water, where a lot of the bait is getting sort of squashed into an area where it's not quite clear, but it's just starting to change colour, and it's game on in a lot of those spots as well. So that's sort of some things around water clarity. Even just looking on Google Maps or whatever, whatever sites you're using for locating areas, you can often see the discoloured water at one particular moment in time, and that's a general good guide to have a look. So if you're seeing weed beds on Google Maps, you can tell that that's a fairly clear zone, and you might start pushing a little bit further up. Your question on water temperature is probably, in my mind, aside from casting accuracy, like I spoke earlier, Greg, looking for water temperature is probably the next biggest factor to kick your mangrove jack fishing into gear and be able to outfish people. I've emceed mangrove jack tournaments that we've had on the Gold Coast in southeast Queensland over the last few years, and time and again, the guys that do really well, and I interview them and try and drag tips out of them up on stage, they often end up talking about looking at water temperature and a jump of 1 degree or 1.5 degrees that they can work out with their sounder. So the spots that you're sort of looking for where that often happens is on the Gold Coast. There's areas like little lakes, for example, or little offshoot canals off to the side where water, it doesn't become stale, but it just sits in there, and because it's shallow, it tends to pick up and the water temperature just jacks up in these certain areas of canals. The other side to it is that I find really interesting is a lot of people talk about fishing for mangrove jack on a run-out tide. And for me, if you've had an afternoon where the tide's been low, but it's filling over a rock bar, all those rocks are just that hot you can barely walk on them on the Gold Coast during summer. And that heat, as the tide fills up over those rocks, that heat goes into the water, and a lot of the jacks will sit along those rock walls in that hot water, just like they'll rub themselves up against the pontoon, the black plastic on a pontoon. Those pontoons are like heating irons. They're just sitting in the water the whole time, and they're absorbing that light, those black ones especially, and they're really hot, and the jacks will hang around them. And I've filmed them in there as well, and they'll get sideways up underneath them as close as they can and just sit in that hot water in the shadows. So, yeah, there's some ideas around warmer water and trying to find it, but it's definitely a tip that people use. The better jack fishermen that I've seen pay attention to it. You don't necessarily need a sounder too, Greg. Even just putting your hand in, if you're fishing that top water column, putting your hand in, you'll notice it coming into systems, and that's sort of a gauge that I use at the start of the season to know whether the jacks are going to be firing in a system or not.
Tremendous stuff, mate. Some great tips there. Just going to circle back to the jack's vision again, and a really nice observation there that they've got a large pupil that allows them to see in fairly low light. It also allows them to see in dirty water. So if you look at under a microscope, look at the retina of a fish's eye, there are a couple of different types of cells there. The same cells are present in pretty much every animal's eye, but they're cone cells and they're rod cells. And the cone cells are the ones that distinguish colour. The rod cells are the ones that give contrast. They pick up light and dark. They're very, very sensitive to small amounts of light. And fish have a lot more rod cells in their eyes than humans do when you compare the ratios of rod and cone cells. I don't know specifically about jacks. I suspect, though, if you were to have a look, they would probably have even more again. But what that allows them to do is really pick up contrast, silhouette, shapes and shadows very, very strongly, much more so than we can with our eyes. And so a fish in dirty water, a mangrove jack in dirty water, has got a real advantage. If he's got a large pupil, he's got all these rod cells, he's getting light in there even though the water's dirty, he's probably able to see things that his bait quarry can't see, and gives him a bit of an advantage. So really nice tip there. So there obviously reaches a point, though, at some stage where water clarity becomes so poor that then goes the other way and turns the fish off. So can you give us a bit of an indication of where that fine line is?
As in where the clarity gets so bad that it makes it difficult? Is that what you're talking about?
It obviously reaches a point where, if the water's really dirty, really turbid, that perhaps the fish go off the bite, or does it? Maybe they bite right through that.
What I'm thinking about when you're saying that is about generally when we have flooding rain or a big runoff and it really dirties the system up, the fishing tends to get a lot tougher. Now, guys tend to go and chase Gold Coast barra at that point in the rain, some of the nutty fishermen that are after those things. But for a mangrove jack fisherman, generally what that means is that the numbers of jacks tend to move further down the system at that point. And, when you get a real flooding rain, like we have sometimes that sort of cyclonic weather at times, or the tail end of it, and systems just get completely mudded up, and the jack fishing tends to go a lot slower. And so people tend to sort of fish around the bottom sections of rivers. Like in the Coomera, people will fish around Paradise Point and around Sovereign Islands, and around Nerang, people will fish the bottom areas from TSS down to the Broadwater and things like that. So it definitely can go like that. But in saying that, Greg, some of the biggest jacks that I see taken out every season are taken during those periods, and it's almost like some of the lone giants tend to go up and hang around the drains like you would expect a barra to do in that super dirty water.
Interesting.
Which is, just something that I've noticed over the years, that some of the real big, the mid-60 fish tend to get up and sit right up close to those drains, waiting on that, even in that dirty water and even in the drains.
Excellent stuff. Now, mate, I'm going to keep drilling away and plugging away here on this because there's so much to know. And jacks do have a reputation for being a difficult fish to come across and even more difficult fish to extract. But there are a couple other factors I'd like to flesh out a little bit. So time of day, mate.
You can do it all day. And if you're doing it all day out there and you're putting a full session in, you probably want to be looking at pontoons because they've got that shaded zone all day. But 100% the low light conditions, late afternoon, early morning, and the session is generally extended if you've got heavy cloud cover as well. That definitely plays out the time of day. And even as detailed as this, if you get a morning where the cloud cover is intermittent, I'll tend to change my fishing up. If I've got heavy shadows while it's completely clear and the sun's out, I'll tend to try and fish super close in against the structures. And then as it changes, if you get this heavy cloud cover come over, I tend to find that the jacks are more open to coming out and sitting on top of a shallow rock bar, for example, and just patrolling or checking out a shallow rock bar just to see what's happening. And that'll generally happen once that cloud cover comes over. And it's happened time and again to me that I'm just sort of waiting. And then as the cloud fills over for that half an hour, I'll hit that rock bar and away you go. So, but generally super early morning, mate. That's why a lot of people that are fishing gentlemen's hours, for example, they struggle. They really struggle to get going. Yeah. I'm usually up at like 4 a.m. hitting it for a couple of hours before work.
Yep. Okay, and just going back again to water clarity, and just another point that I guess I'd like to make there is when you've got a little bit of colour in the water, whether it's a bit of sediment that's coming down because you've had some recent rain, a bit of algae, it doesn't really matter what it is. But effectively what you've got then is permanent twilight, for the fish. Yeah. What that's doing is filtering the sun out. So do you find with jacks, as we find with lots of other species, that they'll tend to bite through the day more when there's a bit of colour in the water?
I think that plays out brilliantly when you start fishing the back end systems where it's a little bit dirtier, and that probably plays into the sense that the last couple of years I've been fishing natural structure and getting better numbers for longer periods of time because of that water clarity. So just a little bit less up there. So you've also got a lot more overhanging structure and laydowns. But that definitely plays out. In my mind, it sits together with what my experience has been on the coast the last couple of years, just changing it up and chasing those fish up the back of creeks.
And of course, the other factor that comes into play, and it's one of those things that tends to be a bit hush-hush and people hold this a little bit close to their chest, but that's the kind of, the lunar cycles and that sort of thing. Do you have a favourite phase of the moon you like to target jacks on?
I tend to like those bigger tides. So the run-in, when you've got the full moon or the new moon and you've got those bigger tides happening, I tend to like that more, especially if you've got hot water coming into the system with those big tides. So I tend to look at those cycles mainly just for the run that you'll get. And the way that plays out on the Gold Coast is you've got these canals and you've got the points to canals, you've got retaining walls and pontoons that when the water is gushing up against them, it's pushing bait into those areas and making it really difficult for the bait to get away. And it's just a brilliant condition for those jacks to sit, have the bait come to them and then just start smashing them. So if you're finding you've got run in these canals, that's probably a really good time. And it can even be a wind blowing onto a pontoon to exacerbate it as well. That's what I really like, chasing them on pontoons when the wind's up, the tide's running, and it's proper carnage, just pushing bait onto the edge of the pontoon. It's frustrating to fish if you're in a little tinny, but they're the afternoons when I really get excited for it.
Excellent stuff. Now, mate, I'm going to move on in just a moment to tackle, and you've already given us a few clues about what to bring along with us. So short lengths, bait cast rods, lightweight, low profile bait cast reels, they're your preference. Before we get onto the tackle though, mate, and delve a little bit deeper into that, for the guys that don't have a boat or don't have a kayak, are there land-based options for jacks?
There is, and you've got to be bloody mad to do it, because if you can't get out around these pylons to unhook the fish, you've got to be super quick on the draw to be able to try and pull them away. But I was speaking to a mate of mine that I teach with, and he's pulled a 55 and a 50 this week from the bridge. And it's his local, but that's probably my best advice if you're land-based. Go and chase jacks late afternoon around the bridge pylons and throw between the bridge pylons, along the bridge pylons, even down in front before you walk down and spook the bait off the edge of the bank as you approach the bridge. Just stand back and toss a couple of little short casts right into the shallows and tweak your lure in the shallows underneath that shadowed bridge area. And that's probably your best bet to be able to get access to areas on the Gold Coast. And there's tons of bridges. I reckon if I was a land-based fisherman going hunting jacks, I'd wait for a stormy afternoon and I'd go jump in my car, go looking for bridges and just hit 6, 7, 8 bridges and give them 20 minutes each or something like that of an afternoon. And I reckon you'd be a pretty good shot at getting onto them. Throwing deep diving lures in between the pylons, dragging them down and just tweaking them, sitting them, stalling them right beside the pylons would be a good way to go. But you'd probably have to jack your gear up, Greg, because the moment they hit, they know where they're running and they'll tie you in knots and figure eights is just the start of it around pylons.
You don't have quite the same flexibility to position yourself to, cast from various angles and to put the electric into autopilot and zap away from the pylon, drag the fish out with you. So you do have to be a little bit smarter about it, but some great tips there nonetheless, and it is possible if you're land-based to get on them. So don't feel disheartened if you don't have a boat. There are options there. All right, mate, let's get on to the tackle side of things now. So bait cast rod and reel. Do you want to drop a name or a brand or two there that will help our listeners get a bit of an idea? What sort of line classes do you use? Let's talk about lines and leaders as well, mate.
Yeah, okay. So I fish a couple of different setups, right? And I should talk on the spinning outfits in a second. But the bait casting setups that I run, low profile, Shimano Curados is my favourite way to go. They're light and you can ram the drag up on them. They're great. The rods that I use are like an 8 to 10 kilo, 5'6" heavy action rod. And that seems, for fishing in a canal or an estuary down in southeast Queensland, that seems like a super heavy setup for a lot of people, especially if they come across from bass fishing of like a 1 to 3, 2 to 5 kilo rod. An 8 to 10 kilo, 5'6" stick is super heavy. But what that allows you to do, if you're fishing with a rod like that, it allows you to get the action on the lures that really turn a jack on, and it gives you that casting accuracy and it gives you that hurt on the fish. It gives you that power in the stick to be able to pull them and turn them, disorient them and get them out of their zone and back into your boat, hopefully. Gives you the best chance of that. So that's the way I go with my bait casting setup. Usually, if I'm using a bait caster, I'm either throwing a popper or a diving lure, like I'm fishing hard body lures if I'm using my bait casting setup. The other bait casting setup that I've got is, again, a Shimano Curado. I always run like 20-pound braid and 20-pound fluorocarbon leader on my bait casters. But I'm running a Shimano Bass Raider, and this is a much lighter setup. It's a 3 to 5 kilo Bass Raider, and it's a medium action tip. And I use it for skip casting, so you can load the rod up and get the lure skipping underneath snags. And I'll use that setup if I'm up the back creeks or if I'm trying to get really creative and flicky in and around pontoons and underneath overhanging structures and things like that, like some docks, for example. And that's one super exciting way of going after Mangrove Jack that a lot of people aren't really doing, and that's one big advantage that I've found to get numbers in southeast Queensland is to do that. So they're my bait casting setups. The spinning outfits that I use, they're really reasonably priced for a lot of people that are trying to get into it. If you're wanting to go and chase fish with a spinning outfit, I just use the entry-level Shimano gear. The best spinning outfit I've got is probably a 2500 Shimano Stratic. And I put my reels on, it's a 7'6" snapper spin rod. It's a really reasonably priced. It's like the lowest entry price Shimano Starlo Classic stick. And it's just real heavy. But what you can do with that thing is get good leverage fishing around pontoons. So my spinning outfits are straight through 20-pound fluorocarbon. to casting fluorocarbon, like Vanish is a good example of a reasonably priced casting fluorocarbon, and that's what I'll use to chase fish around pontoons. The reason for that, Greg, is the fluorocarbon has a much better abrasion resistance than the braid, and if you're getting big jacks in and around pontoons, they're running 15, 20 metres underneath around the pylons and pontoons and rubbing you up against those oyster-encrusted pontoons and barnacle-encrusted edges. So you need that abrasion resistance with that fluorocarbon. I just think it makes a big difference to not getting popped as much. And I've caught a lot of big fish, and I've brought in my cast length of fluorocarbon completely just chuffed up and abraded.
Another awesome tip there, mate. They just keep on coming. All right, look, what we're going to do next, this is the part that you're going to revel in, mate. You're the lure guy after all. So we're going to talk about lures in just a moment. I'm going to get you to come up with just a handful of lures that if we were to hit the Gold Coast over the next few months, you'd be pretty confident we've got all our options covered and got a pretty good chance of picking up a jack. Mate, we are now at that pointy end of the interview where we start to talk about lures, and you've got the hard job of narrowing it down to just a handful that you'd be happy to throw at jacks over the next few months. So let's start with your first lure choice, mate.
Let's start with like a diving lure, which I think is probably the way to go for someone just who turns up on the Gold Coast looking for a jack and wants to flick along one of those rock bars or around a pylon or a couple of bridges. My diving lure of choice would be the Tiemco Sumari. It's a 90F deep, and they're a little bit difficult to find, but some of the better tackle stores around the coast have got them. The reason I think it is so effective, Greg, is because of the high cadence it's got, and it's very tight action. And with heavier hooks, if you put a BKK Raptor Z on the front and own a 2 times strong on the back, you can get a perfect balanced suspended hard body lure that will just sit in the jack's face. They're exceptionally good to cast. They've got a transferring weight system in them and a beautiful profile, but it's really that action, that high, tight cadence that turns a jack on with a stop-dead suspension that sits right in their face. And that's the way that I like to work it. I'll cast that Tiemco right in, butted up against a retaining wall or hard in against structure, and I'll work it super aggressively with my little 5'6" rod, like a rip stall, and just sit it there and sit it right as close as I can to that structure and wait for that jack to make its decision. And some days it takes no time at all. I've had them take it the moment it lands in the water. It's still backing its way into the snag. On other days, probably the big jack tip I've got is to leave it there longer. The big long stalls where you almost forget you're fishing against those really big structures is probably my best tip in getting a really big jack to come and take your lure. They love a long suspension of a lure in hard against cover. So that's the Tiemco Sumari, mate.
Awesome stuff. Now, mate, when you're fishing that lure, obviously you mentioned you can cast it along the rock walls and through the structure, so you can work it for a long part or a fair part of the retrieve pretty close to structure. Once you're away from the structure, do you work it right to the rod tip in case there's a jack following, or do you just crank in and put the next cast in tight?
That's a great question to bring up, because generally I will only fish the first metre and a half of water. And what you're doing is you're fishing down, if you're fishing the rock walls, you've got about a metre and a half of rock batter until it gets to the point where the mud hits the rock. And a lot of big jacks sit down there. But once you're out of that area, your chances are a lot less that there's one coming along. So generally, I use like a 7.1:1 gear ratio reel to be able to rip that lure in as quick as I can and get back in the strike zone in that really tight area. So usually I'm not fishing all the way back to the boat. But one tip I've got for people that are fishing, and even with trevally, even with bass, golden perch, any type of fishing where you're running a diving lure, what you can do is before you get it to the boat where you'll spook fish, often on the rise as you pull a lure up, you can get a bite, like a reaction bite, like it's getting away. So there's been times where I've been fishing these diving lures, and halfway out, I'll do like a rod tip lift just a little bit early, and that'll pull the lure up like it's about to get away, but the fish isn't close enough to the boat to be spooked, and it'll take it at that point. So that's just something I've learned and used over the years that has worked. But generally I'm in hard against the bank, 1.5 metres or so, something like that, and then I'm just whipping it back and getting it back straight back in there.
Yeah, good stuff. And it is a common rookie mistake. And Jack's one example of this. JP's up here, another example where blokes will work the lure all the way back to the rod tip, and they've wasted about 3/4 of that time. That'd have been better just crank it in, fire another cast into where the fish are, and just get the lure working in the fish's face. All right, mate, let's move on to lure choice number 2. Looking forward to hearing what this one is.
So this is the Z-Man Diesel Minnow, and it's the 4-inch in a pearl colour. And there's another one called a red shad, which has been really good for me the last couple of months. But the pearl diesel minnow on a like a 3/8 ounce jig head, like a TT jig head with like a 3/0 size hook on that. That's the little gem that you'll run across the edge of pontoons with. And at a medium speed, like nudging the edge of a pontoon, they're just dynamite. And for the biggest fish that have been taken over the last, I'd say probably 5 or 6 years on the Gold Coast, so many of them have come on those Z-Man Diesel minnows. It's insane. I mean, a lot of guys are fishing those as their preference, so there's a lot more of them in the water, but they're uncanny the way that they can get those fish out of a pontoon and get you your PB Jack. So it'll be that Z-Man Diesel minnows. You can also run them with a snake lock system, which is super effective if you're fishing heavy cover or if you've got like a crab pot rope coming down the edge of a pontoon that you don't want to be getting snagged on and then embarrass yourself in front of the people that own the place where you're fishing. Your snake lock setups are pretty good for that.
All right, mate. So walk us through. So these are great Z-Man Diesel minnows, fantastic around the pontoons. So when you're motoring up to a pontoon to peg one of these lures in there to target a jack, how do you go about positioning your boat?
So I'm super stealthy. I'm running my iPilot, and I've got a little tinny that's super nimble. So I'm heading up, and I'm trying to get myself parallel right along the edge of that pontoon. I try to stay well back. That just gives me the stealth. Like, these jacks are ridiculously sensitive to stuff. Even like putting a rod tip down on the edge of your boat and hearing that tink.
Yep.
I've seen them take off on that. So I'm super quiet on the motor, and I'll kill the motor and just sort of half drift into position and then fling my lure over the back, past the back end of the pontoon generally, and then just try and get it running back beside, but just under that edge of the pontoon. Usually it's, maybe a foot down, or if it's super clear, I might let it sink a little bit and then bring it back from there. But you want to be in that shadow that's cast by that pontoon, or else you're literally no chance at all. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people getting into chasing big jacks around these pontoons really struggle with. It's just they get a little bit casual with how close they are to the pontoon. I'm often just like leaning out over the edge of the boat, pointing my rod tip as close as I can get out over the edge to try and drag it in, around, or even under that pontoon to get that jack to bite.
Yeah, good stuff. And so, by the sounds of it, you were coming from down current and you're working the lure back towards you with the current, is that right?
Yeah, most of the time, that's ideal. That's what you want, ideal. Maybe you can't get it all the time, but the other point that I would say about that too, Greg, a lot of people that go and fish these pontoons start to get a bit jiggy with their lures because they've come from bream and bass fishing to get a reaction bite. The jacks want a constant retrieve that is it's just humming along the edge of that pontoon. No jigging, you're not dropping it, you're just bringing it straight in. They hear it, they hone in on it with that lateral line, and then they smack it and they won't miss. So, yeah, you don't need to get jiggy with it. If you do that, you'll end up pulling trevally and cod, and you'll end up with a lot more bycatch. So if you're hard out chasing a jack, just hum that little sucker nice and close to the pontoon, consistent as you can get it.
Right, and of course, if you're a bait fish in that part of the world and you're swimming around near pontoons, you ain't going to be just dawdling around and loitering. You're going to be moving through there as quick as you can, because old Jack's going to come out and get you. So, by keeping the lure moving, you're giving a more natural presentation as well. So, John, let's hear your third lure choice, mate.
All right, mate, it's a big toss-up. And I've got two written down here. One's a top water lure and another one is a soft plastic for skip casting. Can I touch on both of them quickly?
Tell you what, mate, you can touch on both of them for as long as you like, because Jacks are one of my favourite species and I'm really enjoying this conversation. So go for it, mate.
Brilliant. This top water lure might come as a surprise to a lot of fishermen because they love getting after them with poppers. But I've got a Boy Howdy by Cotton Cordell in the gold colour. Is a dual-propped fizzer. So there's props at both ends. It looks a lot like a garfish. And if you work that thing hard, aggressive, and get those two props just cooking, over like a 30 centimetre rip, and then you stall it and let it sit up on the surface again. Those prop baits are just insanely effective, and I've caught way more jacks on that thing than anything else. And the aggressive retrieve is the way to go. And any top water fishing is mind-blowing. But when you hear a jaw crack from a jack and your line tightens, I don't know what else comes close, mate. It's hard. It's like heart-wrenching stuff. And you end up shaking on the bottom of the boat, and you can't get the hooks out of the fish because your hands are shaking, and it's a brilliant moment. So the Boy Howdy by Cotton Cordell, Rapala make one as well that's similar, but that'd be my preference.
Right, okay. Now, that's really interesting for me because I know, that's a lure that's been designed primarily for largemouth bass fishing in the US, and it's a lure that's designed to be worked quite slowly. And those props will create a little bit of turbulence, a little bit of noise at very, very slow, constant retrieves, which is how they're often fished over in the US for the largemouth bass. And one of the things I love about talking to our Aussie homegrown fishermen is that often they're using lures that were designed for something completely different in a different way and catching fish on them. So I love all of that. So, mate,
you'll have to upgrade those trebles though. They come with those super soft eagle claw trebles. I put Owner 2X Strongs on them, and they're good.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Let's hear your last one, mate.
So the last one is a 4.5-inch pearl, or I think it's called Silver Flash. It's a Flash Arrow J Shad SW. Now that's basically like a 4.5-inch shad style lure with a thumping paddle tail on the back, but they've been designed with belly slits so that you can run a weedless hook through them, and they skip like a dream. And people that haven't heard of skip casting or don't know what I'm talking about like skimming a rock, flying a lure across the surface like you might see a skipping bait fish that's heading away from a predatory fish, but flinging it so it skips underneath overhanging cover deep into the back area of, maybe it might be a tree or a mangrove system in between those roots and things like that. And that little lure, it doesn't take long to get that paddle tail going, and it looks just like a potty mullet. And boy, the fishing you can get onto doing that is nuts because you're hitting zones that never get hit by fishermen. So the fish are super confident that they've got you, that they've got what they're after, and they'll hit it. And then the fight in heavy cover, close quarters, is insane. So that's probably one of my favourites, and one that I've always got rigged onto a weighted weedless worm hook is what I use to skip cast with those things, mate.
Tremendous stuff. Oh, mate, I'm ready to go out fishing. I might have to kill the microphone and head out for a fish. All right, mate. Now let's take it home. So, John, look, you've got a lot of things going on, but let's talk about some of the projects that you've got underway at the moment. And for those that haven't found John's website and his YouTube channel, really, really worth going and having a look, whether you're a Gold Coast-based angler or whether you fish in other areas. Ton of great information there, mate. So fill us in on some of the things you've been up to and some of the things you've got coming up.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so I've been running social channels for about 7 years now, and My Lure Box is where I put most of my content on YouTube. I've got mylurebox.com.au, but if you're looking for tips, and there's over 200 lure reviews up there now, a lot of them are Mangrove Jack lures, that's a really good place to go. And I talk about how to upgrade trebles, what sort of retrieves work. There's action in there, like live action of all the hookups and casts and how to do it. So there's a ton of stuff on there. But look, if someone's wanting to actually get their head around this stuff and see it for themselves, I've produced 2 Mangrove Jack fishing DVDs. And there's 2 others, a big flathead one and a guide to fishing the Gold Coast from a kayak. But Monster Jacks is about it's a guide to catching massive mangrove jack on the Gold Coast and in the estuaries and canal systems. And that's probably the most detailed look at it for someone that's sort of interested in this information and wants to get their hands on some visual stuff. That encapsulates, it's got giants right through it and a lot of good information. You can get that as a download through my website, or there's links all over my socials. But Monster Jacks and another one called The Jack Guide. So that's the main place where I keep most of my stuff, mate. And there's some places where people can go if they want to get some more information or just get jacked for some mangrove jack fishing and get themselves prepped and ready to get out there.
Great stuff. Now, folks, of course, I'm going to put some show notes together for this episode. It's going to take quite a while because I reckon about halfway through I'm just going to give up and grab a rod and go jack fishing. But it's been a great conversation. There's been a lot of information shared. But, of course, if you zap over to doclures.com, type Costello into the search bar, that's COSTELLO, that's going to bring up the show notes for this episode. All the tips that John shared are going to be summarized there neatly for you. You can download it as a PDF. And, of course, the MP3 for this episode will be there as well. If you're listening to it on iTunes or something like that, but you want to download it to listen in the car, that'll all be there as well. And of course, I'm going to link to all of John's products. So if you want to pick those videos up and get some really good information, you'll find links to those things, to those videos on the show notes as well as some contacts for John via his social channels, YouTube and Facebook and all that kind of stuff. So tremendous stuff. Now, John, it has been absolutely fantastic. You've given us a ton of great information, but you're not off the hook yet, mate. Excuse the pun. We're going to have one last question, mate, to take the episode home, and it's a doozy, mate. You've told us we've got to expect to lose a few lures. If we're not throwing them where we're going to lose them, we're probably not going to be hooking jacks. Give us a few tips for getting those lures back with a fish attached to them, mate. So, jacks have got a fierce reputation, deservedly so, for taking your lures with them and disappearing back into their hidey holes. Give us a couple of tips for extracting them, mate, once you've got them to take a lure.
Mate, this question's put a huge smile on my face. It was literally like 3 days ago. I had a mate in a boat who's come from bass fishing, and he got snapped off on the best fish of the day, and it broke his heart, but he loved it all the same. But it was just the fact, I checked his drag after. It was just way too light to be a genuine shot at pulling in a bigger fish. And that's probably one of the trips that knock people over at the first hurdle of hooking a big jack and getting it in. Their drag isn't tight enough, regardless if they're running 20 or 40 pound. You need to be running a pretty tight drag. Mine's close to locked at 20 pound on a Shimano Corrado, and you want to be testing that out of the tip of the rod, not at your hand unless you're really versed in it. It needs to be super heavy. Basically whatever your 20 pound or bigger can take, because they are just so ruthless and so fast that even at that, there's a lot of unstoppables that I can't turn. And it's probably that first thing that people struggle with. The next thing I would say is, once you get that fish hooked, having a good hook set, they tend to hook themselves so hard the way that they hit lures that if you don't have heavy enough hooks and heavy enough terminal tackle, then you're really going to struggle as well. But you've just got to give it hell. You've got to give it absolute hell. So the moment it hooks up, if your drag's set right, you've got to give it absolutely everything you can to try and disorient it or turn it. And once you get it out, don't think the fight's over. You've got to be right on top of that thing and try and get her in the net. But maybe, if you're fishing in a kayak, a lot of people lose fish because the really big fish, they often swim out underneath the boat and start heading for the biggest snag, which might even be across the river. And if you start pulling up too hard on a fish that's deep, you tend to pop the hooks as well. So, mate, I don't know. I really, there's times when you're just so nervous, you don't really know what to do. But to try and disorient it, get it out of the structure as best as you can. And if you're fishing pontoons, dunk your rod down under to create an angle so that the jack doesn't have that angle via the edge of the pontoon where it's just rubbing you on. So usually I will dunk my rod tip straight down underneath the surface of the water to try and pull down and away, because you can bet your bottom dollar they are rubbing their face on the side of that pontoon and across the barnacles to pull your hooks out.
Tremendous stuff, mate. The only finesse about jack fishing is landing that lure in the right place. After that, it's just white knuckle brutality. There's no other way to describe it.
Greg, the only other point that I really want to make, and this is something that I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, mate, and it's something that I've got to commend you and the guys that have been on here for, is so often they talk about proper handling of fish and catch and release fishing, and that's been a huge part of the fishing for me. Being happy to share some of these tips with people is that they tend to practice catch and release and really good handling of fish, and that's a damn good reason why there's so many good jacks still hanging around the coast. We're so lucky we've got great numbers of fish here, but there's a lot of guys that catch the majority of those fish that are doing the right thing and looking after them, not hanging them from grips and stretching their soft tissues around their gills and, not cooking them in live wells where the water's too hot, but, releasing them in good nick and trying to look after them, mate. So that's a big part of what I advocate for as well. And I know it's something that you do as well, mate. So I just want to make a point of that before we wrap up.
Absolutely, mate. I'm so glad you did, because, yes, that is absolutely something that I'm very passionate about. And like you say, most of the guys that come on the show are also in that camp, want to see the fish there to fight another day, want to see them there to spawn and restock our systems, make sure that we've got fish for the future. So tremendous tips there, mate. And I can't agree more. In fact, I was watching on YouTube just today bloke holding a fish by the mouth, got the hand underneath the gills, the fish is slumped over his hand, and he just released that fish into the water. And I thought, that fish is not going to survive. You may as well have put that on ice and taken it home. Comfort lift them, guys. Don't put any stress on those gills because you're only going to damage the fish and reduce their chances of surviving. So, mate, tremendous way to finish the episode. I really appreciate everything that you've given us here today. It's been absolutely brilliant. I've learned some things. I'm sure our listeners have learned some things as well. And for that, we thank you, and we'll see you out on the water sometime.
Thanks a lot, Greg, and keep doing what you're doing, mate. I really enjoy the podcast myself. It's great stuff. I'll speak to you soon.
Right back at you, mate, because I enjoy all your YouTube stuff as well. So we'll have to get together over a beer sometime.
Don't miss a single episode of ALF. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes, or jump on the doclures.com website for downloads and show notes. Till the next episode, Tidelines.